Music Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. And you know what I feel like doing today? Just an old-fashioned recording to tape radio show. So, as you're listening to this, yes, it's another radio show or podcast, however you're listening to this. If you listen to the podcast, you're going to hear, much better fidelity what I'm talking about. On the AM radio, you're probably not going to be able to tell one bit. But I'm recording to tape today. And not only am I recording to tape, I am recording to type 1 normal tape, normal bias tape, with no noise reduction. And the reason I'm doing that, I kind of debated before I hit record here on the show. I was like, you know what, am I going to record this do I want to record this to type 4 metal tape with Dolby Type S noise reduction, which is the best noise reduction you can get on a consumer cassette deck, using the best possible cassette tapes you could have purchased. I don't know if they probably don't still make Type 4 metal tapes. They don't make many cassette tapes, period. Tascam has some new high bias tapes coming out that I can't wait to get a batch of, get one or two, and kind of test and put through its paces. Although Tascam says, not to get too sidetracked here, but Tascam says technically these tapes, yes, they are high bias Type 2 tapes, but they're not the same type of compound. They're not the same type of chemicals used, elements used in Type 2 tapes that we remember from the 80s and 90s. I think Type 2 went back to the 70s, but kind of the peak of Type 2 cassette tapes was 80s and early 90s. You remember you would go buy those like TDK CD It tapes or Maxell tapes. What do I got here? I got a Maxell. No, this is a TDK metal tape. It's an MA110. 110. That's kind of thin tape right there. Where's my high bias tape? This one that I'm holding, TDK CD Power. It's a 90-minute tape. It's a Type 2 high bias tape. So all I was getting at is in the 80s and 90s, the formulation was kind of at its peak. Those were the best high bias tapes you could get. And they were back in that era. Tascam has said the new Type 2 tapes, due to an oxide shortage, they're technically high bias tapes, but it's not the same formulation. That's the word I was looking for earlier. Formulation. They're not the same formulation. Either way, I'm sure they'll still sound great, especially with some noise reduction going on. People are kind of back and forth. I mean, if you go on online and kind of Google, noise reduction, DBX noise reduction, Dolby B, C, and S noise reduction, there's people kind of on both sides of the fence about it. Some people hate noise reduction. They don't want to use it at all. Matter of fact, I'm not in the camp that I hate noise reduction. I just think noise reduction, it 100% depends on the tape deck used to record it. So Dolby B, typically, I remember in a car, driving around the car, putting the cassette tape in, and disabling Dolby B because you get more high end out of the tape, out of the factory recorded commercial tape. You're listening to Third Eye Blind or something on cassette tape. You disengage Dolby noise reduction in your car's audio system, cassette deck, and you get more high end. It just sounds better. Yes, there's a little bit more hiss, but you don't lose any of the information in the hi-hats and the upper air range of the singer's voice or anything like that. And that's kind of why I didn't like noise reduction. But having a good tape deck, I've got a Sony TCK615S. It's a 3-head tape deck with all the way up to Dolby S. If you turn on Dolby B, first of all, you calibrate the tape. You use the calibration function to calibrate the recording level and bias and get the meters lined up just right. It's very cathartic. This is one reason I love recording to tapes. You get the meters lined up just right. And then, because it's a 3-head deck, you enable Dolby B when you record something, and you can hit the monitor button and switch back and forth from what you're listening to. So you can listen to the source audio, or you can listen to what's actually on the tape. When you hit the monitors button and it displays tape on the display there, you're listening to what's going down on the tape. So you can adjust the recording level and the bias, and then you A/B it between the tape and the source to get it to match just right. And remember, this is with Dolby B on, that you are matching it to the source sound as best as possible. And when you turn Dolby B on, or C or S for that matter, and you get the sound coming off the tape to match as closely as possible to the source sound, noise reduction is amazing. And that's a roundabout way of me saying I chose today to record to Type 1 normal bias tape with 0 noise reduction, as opposed to recording to Type 4 metal tape with Dolby S noise reduction. Because if I recorded to metal tape with Dolby S noise reduction on this cassette deck, you would have absolutely no idea that I was using tape. There would be virtually no hiss. There would be no discernible hiss. Even in the quietest parts of this broadcast here, of this podcast here, you wouldn't be able to hear any discernible hiss. It would be such a low noise floor that it might as well just be digital the whole time. Yes, technically while you're listening to it, it's digital. Technically while you're listening to the broadcast, it's digital too, because I have to convert these to waves or MP3s for broadcast. Doesn't matter how I deliver it to the station. If I deliver it to the station as huge wave files, when you upload it into the software, the radio station software, it automatically converts it to an MP3 of not great quality. I think it's around 160 kilobits per second. Either way, you're listening to this microphone going through a tube preamp, 100% tube preamp, recorded to Type 1 normal bias cassette tape with no noise reduction. So if you're listening to the podcast, you should be able to hear a little bit of hiss, a little bit of nostalgia. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. You may be wondering if you're listening to the broadcast and you're still here after the commercials and you listen to the last segment. Podcast doesn't matter. But you may be wondering why I'm on a cassette kick again. You are and you aren't. Long-time listeners know that I go on cassette kicks from time to time. I have a lot of listeners who got into cassettes because I talked about cassettes on the show, because I do geek out from cassettes often. It's one of my, if I'm just honest with myself, it is one of my most major geek things. It's the geek thing that I keep turning back to as more often than kind of anything else. So on my desk here in my solar-powered Geek Therapy Radio studios, on my big producer desk here, RTA, I think it's the RTA producer desk. It's the big one, 72 inches wide, multi-tiered. Love this desk. I've got my Sony cassette deck, and I'll tell you the story behind it and kind of also what got me on this kick. Let me put a pin in my telling you about my cassette deck that I'm using to record the show with. And to be specific, I record the show into Reaper on my computer, and then I dump it onto the tape, and then I dump it off the tape again back into Reaper before I upload it as a podcast and before I send it off to the radio station. So I record on the computer, then I dump it to tape, then I dump it from the tape back to the computer, so it takes all the tape qualities with it. And that's how I deliver it. So anyways, before I talk about the tape deck that I'm using, the Sony TC-K615S, I want to tell you kind of what got me back on this tape kick. So a few months ago, a friend gave me, he was, where was he? I think he was at his dad's house or something like that. And he said, hey, my dad has this Tascam Porta 02 4-track cassette recorder that he obviously doesn't use. He hasn't touched it in 20 or 30 years. It's in pristine condition. Do you want it? It's like, yeah, absolutely. So I have this blue Tascam Porta 02. It's Mark 1. It's not the Mark 2, but it doesn't matter for what I'm about to tell you. I've got this Tascam Porta 02. I know a lot of you listening, maybe on the radio right now, maybe on the podcast right now, who maybe were singer-songwriters or were in a band back in high school or middle school or college back when recording to four-track cassette recorders was basically the only way that you could record demos and you could record your song ideas. That person listening has probably used a Tascam Porta 02. It's the blue 4-track tape recorder. Whether they used a Porta-02 or any manner of 4-track cassette recorder from Tascam mostly, Fostex or even Yamaha, there were some other companies that made 4-track cassette recorders. You probably know what I'm talking about here. So I got the Tascam Porta-02 in pristine condition. And let me just say, right before I start tearing apart, just eviscerating the Tascam Porta-02, which I made a video on my YouTube channel about this very subject, by the way, Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube. Look for the red, white, and black color scheme. Before I tear up the Porta-02, I just want to say that 4-track recorders on the whole, one reason why they are good investments if you want to get into cassette recording, perhaps one of the only saving graces, especially for cheaper 4-track cassette recorders, is that the transport mechanism is very robust. So the tape head is robust, the capstan is robust, the pinch roller is robust, the motors are robust. Sometimes in these things, it's not just one motor like in normal consumer cassette decks like you would have in your car or you'd have kind of in your hi-fi at home that use one motor for playback, rewinding, and fast forwarding. Usually in 4-track cassette recorders, you have 2 or 3 motors controlling each of those separate functions. So it's not just redundancy. It's instead of wearing out one motor playing and doing the fast forwarding and rewinding functions, you have one motor for playback and you have another motor that takes care of rewinding, and another motor up to another motor taking care of fast forwarding. The transport is very robust. They don't break. They last a really long time, and they are just ready for the abuse of playing and recording and stopping and rewinding and playing and recording and stopping, because that's what it was used for. It was used for musicians back in the day to record demos and record song ideas, and they're constantly punching in and out and recording tracks. I'm going to record the drums to track 1. All right, I'm going to record the bass to track 2. All right, I'm going to record the guitars to track 3, and then the vocals to track 4. That was kind of a basic layout, although if you want to get technical with it, some people would record the higher energy material to the inner tracks. So you'd record the drums because of the kick drum and everything to the track number 2, an interior track, and then the bass to track number 3, an interior track, theoretically because it has more, it could possibly have some more real estate to record onto the magnetic particles, and then you leave the least energy stuff to the outside. So the vocals on the 4th track and maybe the guitars on track 1. There's another school of thought here is that you don't want the drums and the bass right next to each other on tracks. That on a 4-track recorder, maybe you would do the drums on like track 3 because the kick drum might have the most energy, and then the bass drum or the bass guitar over on track 1. So there's always a track between the 2 highest energy tracks, highest energy instruments, so that you avoid bleed of the bass guitar going into the drum track, or you avoid bleed of the kick drum going over to the bass. There's all sorts of different theories. That's a whole nother show to talk about 4-track recording theory. But before I eviscerate the Porta-02, let me just say that 4-track tape recorders have very robust transports. That being said, so that's one draw to them. That being said, the Porta-02, I went on eBay and I was like, okay, Porta-02s, I know the cassette comeback is a thing and they're all hyped right now, but the Porta-02 was not the greatest 4-track cassette recorder in the world. There's no way these things are going for more than $50, like in pristine condition on eBay. Go to eBay and look at Porta-02s. These things are collecting $200, $250, $300, sometimes over $300, and it just boggles my mind, and I'll tell you why it boggles my mind. The noise floor on the Porta-02 is atrocious. And like I said in my video, you might be saying to yourself, oh, that's just, tape hiss. That's a noise floor. Of course it's going to have a high noise floor. It's tape hiss. There's no noise reduction on a Porta-02. So yeah, the hiss of the tape is going to be high. That's not what it is. The machine with no tape inside it, and I demonstrated this on the video that I made, the machine with no tape inside it gives off its own just noise. And it's actually high noise. It's hard to demonstrate on YouTube or with like podcasts and stuff, but if you have a Porta-02 and you plug in the headphones to the headphone jack, even with the volume all the way down and no tape in the deck, there's just a coming out the headphone jack. And the same thing with the line outputs. If you just plug in some studio monitors into the line outputs, volume all the way down, no tape in the deck, not even playing, the thing is it's just on. All you've done is powered on the Porta O2. All you're going to hear from the outputs is, it's not deafening, but it's loud enough to be on everything. So let's say you record the tape. First of all, the Porta O2 has a frequency response of, I think it's 50 or 60 hertz. I think it's 50 hertz, which is not too bad, up to 12,000 hertz, which is bad. And I demonstrated that on the video. It doesn't have a very high frequency response, high frequency range, and the signal to noise ratio is like 46 dB. It's ridiculous, plus the noise floor of the machine itself. So I tell you this in this segment as kind of a cautionary tale. There are better 4-tracks around for the same price. I can't rattle them off for you right now, but if you can find like a Tascam 414 or 424 or something like that, or even older models, they sound much better. The frequency response isn't much different recording at normal tape speed. Like if you can only record at normal tape speed, then you're going to get the kind of 50 to 12.5K frequency response. But if you can record at a higher tape speed, double tape speed, you can get that from like 50 hertz all the way up to like 16 kilohertz, which sounds really, really good. I'm just saying, cautionary tale, Porta O2, you'll see them around if you want to get back into 4-track cassette recording. You can do better than the Porta O2. That's not the type of hiss that people are talking about nostalgically. Not machine hiss, just low tape hiss. That shouldn't be a factor. More Geek Therapy Radio. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Just a reminder, if you're listening to the radio, I recorded this radio show on a Type 1 normal bias tape with no noise reduction. So does that matter for AM radio? Probably not, but you can definitely tell on the podcast. But it should still sound really good. I'm using a really good cassette deck to record this to that allows me to calibrate the tape, and even with no noise reduction, even with some hiss, it should still sound pretty good. So in the last segment, I talked mostly about the Porta O2, but I promised that I would talk about my specific tape deck. Now, what I'm going to do here real quick, the model is the Sony TC-K615S, and I'm going to go on eBay right now as I'm recording here. I'm going to see if any of them show up on eBay and see how much they would cost on eBay. So I'm just going to type in K615S and see if any come up here. Whoa-ly moly. There's one that's been refurbished for $440 plus $25 for shipping. There's one that's parts only for $190. There's another parts only for $250. There's a few belts around here, one for $11, one for $20. So I see two decks here. One of them is parts only for, or two of them are parts only, $190, and then there's another one for $250 parts only. And then there's one that says refurbished for $440. That is a solid chunk of change. I would say, though, so if you type in like Nakamichi Dragon, let's type in Nakamichi Dragon, Nakamichi Dragon, and see how much that deck costs. Here's the first one that pops up. $4,990 for a cassette recorder. And then what is the shipping on this? $180 of shipping. So here's the thing. Here's the thing. This Nakamichi Dragon here is the top of the line. It's arguably the best cassette deck that has ever been made in the history of time. You can get a frequency response out of a metal tape on the Nakamichi Dragon between 20 hertz and over 22,000 hertz, just on high bias tape. The signal to noise ratio, I believe, achievable by the Nakamichi Dragon is something on the order of like 95 dB of signal to noise. Let's see here if it shows it on the listing here. Transport, of course, it's 3-head. It can do type 1, 2, and 3 tape. Yeah. Does it say? It doesn't say here, but if you do your research on the Nakamichi Dragon signal to noise ratio, and why don't I just do that since I've got the Google open here, Nakamichi Dragon signal to noise ratio. Let's see what we can pull up. Signal to noise. I want to say it's over 90, especially with noise reduction. Like if you use Dolby S noise reduction or even Dolby C, I think you can get it much higher than that. So it's saying right here 74 dB of signal to noise ratio, but that's with no noise reduction. I know that on my Sony deck, I can get 85 dB of signal to noise ratio with Dolby S noise reduction enabled. That's kind of my point here with this. When you're talking about 85 dBs of signal to noise ratio or 90 dB of signal to noise ratio, I believe CDs, 16-bit 44K CDs are like 96 dB of signal to noise ratio. So the best cassette decks using good cassette tapes approached near as makes absolutely no audible difference, the same signal to noise ratio as pure digital. So I'm going to type in CD signal to noise ratio, signal to noise ratio. I want to say it's 96 because of, and it says it depends. It depends on the CD deck, because every machine is going to kind of introduce its own noise floor. That's why I said the Porter 02 has a very high noise floor, because the machine itself adds its own noise. And yeah, as I'm reading here, I'm pulling this off of a website somewhere. The dynamic range of a Red Book audio CD, that is kind of like the standard for audio CDs used by the recording industry, and it's agreed upon by international communities and all that stuff. The dynamic range of a Red Book audio CD at 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz is commonly cited as 90 dB, 96 dB, and 98 dB. And that is about where the top of the line cassette decks could do towards the end of their run. I would say towards the late 80s and kind of mid 90s, early to mid 90s. Good cassette decks approach that signal to noise ratio. My Sony TC K615S can do 85 dB of signal to noise, which, here's the thing, that's a very low noise floor. That is a very, very high fidelity. This deck can also do up to it's like 20 to 20 kilohertz frequency response that you can record to tape. It's very good. So 20 to 20K frequency response and up to 85 dB of signal to noise ratio using a metal tape and Dolby S noise reduction. You wouldn't be able to tell it apart if you were just listening to Alter Bridge on a CD or an MP3. Actually, if you listen to Alter Bridge MP3 and then listen to it pure from a cassette tape, this cassette would sound better. Listen to the hi-hats. The way you can tell a crappy MP3 is the hi-hats just break apart. That high frequency information, it disintegrates and it sounds trash on an MP3 compared to listening to like a 24-bit FLAC or a WAV file or something where that hasn't been, the data hasn't been compressed. So anyways, I want to talk about the story behind this cassette deck. First, I'll just say, if you are looking for cassette decks on eBay or wherever you're finding them, look for a 3-head cassette deck. A 3-head cassette deck is how you can monitor, you can switch between the source on the deck to listen to the source material you're recording and then listen to what's coming up off of the tape. That is only achievable with the 3-head deck. Most decks you'll find, if you cruise around eBay and it's a 2-head deck, you can't listen to what's going on to the tape. You can't listen as you're recording to what's going on and coming off of the tape, so that you can match and get the settings just right to make sure that what's on tape sounds as close as possible to the source material. That is something you can only do with the 3-head deck. So that's my advice to you, is save a few extra pennies if you want to go out there and you're specifically looking for a good deck. Look for a 3-head deck. I don't care what kind of it says about the capstan or what the head is made out of, more than I care about that it's a 3-head deck, because that allows you much more control. That allows you to make much higher quality recordings, and 3-head decks typically have better noise reduction. They always have Dolby B. Usually they have Dolby C on a 3-head deck, and if you're getting a high-end deck, it'll have Dolby S and HX headroom expansion. Headroom HX Pro you'll see on decks, that's not noise reduction at all. That has something to do with the bias being automatically adjusted to allow more high frequency material through as the program material, as the source material dictates. It's not noise reduction, it just adjusts the bias on the fly. Really what happens is when you lower the bias, you get more high-end frequency response, but you also get more hiss. When you increase the bias on a deck, you get less hiss, but less kind of high-end frequency response. And what HX Pro does, headroom extension does, is it adjusts that bias on the fly. So if you're listening to Alter Bridge and it's just bashing away on the cymbals or something like that, then it automatically raises, or lowers, I should say, the bias in those parts so that those cymbals come through nice and realistic sounding, and it sounds great. HX Pro is great. And you'll find them on high-end decks, such as 3-head decks that typically also have Dolby C and Dolby S noise reduction. Dolby S noise reduction plays well with Dolby B noise reduction. So let's say you recorded on a deck with Dolby S noise reduction, and then you're going to go play back the tape in a car or something. For some reason, the car has a cassette deck in it. You can enable Dolby B noise reduction on a tape that's been recorded with Dolby S, and it will still sound amazing. Dolby C is the redheaded stepchild of noise reduction. So some people like Dolby C noise reduction. Some people don't like Dolby C, but most people like Dolby S, and some people even like Dolby B. Some people don't like noise reduction at all. I feel like such a butthole. I want to tell you about this deck, but I'm running out of time in this segment. I promise segment 4 is going to be all about the history and backstory of my Sony TCK615S. It was my dad's tape deck. I was mentioning that to Asaf. Hey, what's going on, man? On Twitter, that it was my dad's tape deck. And let me just tell you a little bit more of that story coming up here in the next segment. Let me plug on the way out. Geek Therapy Radio in your favorite podcast app. Just type in Geek Therapy Radio or Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, whatever, in your favorite podcast app. Look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and that's me. Same exact thing goes for all social media, and same thing goes for YouTube. Type in Geek Therapy Radio, look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and that's me. Also, geektherapyradio.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. For the radio audience who may just be joining me, I've been talking about cassette tapes and cassette decks. And I promised the listeners, that I would talk about my cassette deck, which, by the way, you are listening to right now. I have recorded the show down onto this cassette deck with Type 1 normal bias tape and no noise reduction. And then I recorded that back into the computer, and that's what you're listening to. You're listening to this podcast and radio show off of a cassette tape. So let me tell you about my cassette deck now, since I've been promising it the whole show. Here's the story behind it. Let me just tell you a little bit about the deck. Again, the model number of my particular cassette deck is the Sony TC-K615S. It's a 3-head cassette deck with Dolby S noise reduction, Headroom Extension Pro, HX Pro. It has calibration controls for bias and recording level. Like I said, noise reduction B, C, and S. And it's all controlled with logic controls. That basically means that There's no physical connection between the play button and the mechanism. It's controlled by circuit boards and logic processors. It's a very good deck. It is considered I would say it's considered kind of a prosumer deck. My dad used this thing. He probably got it, I think it came out early 90s. He recorded, I have a box full of probably 60 or 70 tapes of mostly high bias and metal tapes sitting in a closet, which I know some of you hear that. You got just a box of dozens of metal tapes. Do you know how much those sell for on eBay? I do know how much they sell for on eBay. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go onto eBay right now and just look up random Type 4 metal tape and tell you how much they're selling per cassette. So Type 4 metal. Here's one tape for $21. Here's another one for $25. Here's a lot of 10 for $172. Here's one tape, Sony Metal ES90 Type 4 metal bias tape, sealed, Japan, 1988, $40. So between $20 and $40 is about the cost of one single cassette tape. And I've got dozens of them just sitting in a closet. They're not for sale. I'm holding a metal tape right now that has been recorded on this deck. I'm not going to play it back or anything like that, but it's a TDK MA110 Type 4 metal tape, and what my dad had recorded onto it is Woodstock 1969. So Woodstock on a Type 4 metal tape recorded with a baller tape deck. Of course it's going to sound absolutely astounding. So the story behind this, my Sony tape deck here, is that my dad was going to toss it or throw it away or give it away. I think this was around 2010 or 11, somewhere around there, somewhere between 2009 and, yeah, that's what it would have been, 2009 and, no, it's before that, 2007 and 2010. Somewhere in there he was going to give away this deck because it wasn't working. And I was curious about it because I'm a geek about all things, and I'm a recording engineer, and I went to school for all this stuff, and I knew enough at the time to know, hey, a 3-head tape deck. I didn't know much about cassette tapes. You know, I wasn't a geek about cassettes that I am now, but I knew enough to know that this deck is pretty good. I think he spent close to how much was it back when he got it in 1993? It was several $100s. Like I said, prosumer deck. Anyways, at this point in time, around 2007, 2009-ish, somewhere in that area, I would ballpark. It didn't work. I said, Dad, I'll take it. And he's like, if you can fix it, you can keep it. Otherwise, it's just junk that's going to be laying around. So I took it and I replaced the belt. I researched it a little bit. Internet was a thing still, all the way back in 2007. I said, it just needs a new belt. So I replaced the belt on it and it worked great. I made awesome recordings with it. That's where I really honed my abilities with recording high-quality cassette recordings, was with this deck, and all it needed was a belt. I made a video on YouTube that MKBHD used a clip of when he was doing his consumer rights video, where I was repairing an old Sony Walkman, and in the video I just said, hey, your Walkman or your cassette deck probably still works. All it needs is a belt. 90% of the time, all your broken cassette player needs is a belt. And I demonstrated how to change the belt. And it's the same process for, like I said, 90% of any cassette device anywhere. Just get into it, find where the belt melted or deteriorated, get it off, clean up the pulleys and motors, the tape path or the belt path, clean it all up. Put a new belt on there. You can still find belts. They are still readily available. Anyways, that's how I fixed this cassette deck, the Sony TC-K615S, and it sounds amazing. So the current state of the deck, though, I feel that it is very long in the tooth now. It has gotten way more use out of it than Sony, I think, ever anticipated this cassette deck to ever have. Remember what I mentioned back at the beginning of the show, that one of the draws, even for kind of sound quality flaws of lower-end 4-track cassette recorders, one of the benefits of 4-track cassette recorders is that their transport is very robust and they last a very long time. Playing and recording, stopping, fast forwarding, playing, stopping, recording, fast forwarding, that's what 4-track cassette recorders are made for, to record music demos onto with bands. consumer tape decks transports are a little bit more delicate, and I don't think Sony ever anticipated this model of 3-head cassette deck being used all the way from 1993 to 2022 now. Like, we're going on 30 years at least that this deck has been in service, and Sony, I don't think they ever had any intention of making it last that long. I think they thought, okay, well, this will last as long as belts last, and by that time, like by the time they're making this deck, they've already been producing millions upon millions of CD players and mini disc players. Shout out to Colin, this does not compute. So they're like, yeah, this is kind of the best of the best tape deck, and the next purchase a consumer who buys this deck is going to make is most likely going to be CD player. So that's where this deck sits. I don't think they anticipated it lasting this long. The current state of it is that I think the plastic cogs and gears, because they are plastic cogs and gears in this thing, are starting to slip sometimes. Like if I'm utilizing the transport in a certain position on the plastic gears, then I think some of the teeth are slipping or aren't as strong or maybe cracked, because it seems like every fourth or fifth time I try to rewind, it just doesn't work. It just kind of stops, or the tape moves slowly and then stops, or kind of binds up a little bit and stops. So I have to hit stop and then hit rewind again, and then it goes slow, and then I hit stop, and then I hit rewind again, and it goes full speed, perfect, like everything's fine. So I think I'm at that stage with this tape deck where the actual kind of the plastic mechanism inside is I won't say on its last legs, but it's kind of getting there. And I want to end this by kind of on that point talking about cassette revival, and that there's a lot of hype around cassette decks, and just to be careful about what you buy. If I was rich, I'd buy a Nakamichi. I'm not rich, and part of what scares me about my Sony deck going out is, like, by the time it goes out and I'm cruising around eBay or trying to find another cassette deck of this caliber, it's going to be extremely expensive, and I'm going to have to basically be hunting estate sales and going to garage sales and seeing if I can luck out somewhere, and whatever is going to be out there is going to need some work. So just be careful of that. Know you're going to pay a premium for a high quality cassette deck, and I would say half of that premium is because the cassette comeback. The other half of people in the cassette comeback are going to be disappointed. This sounds crappy. They're going to buy a crappy boombox from 1995, and it's just going to be terrible. So you get what you pay for. Most of all, you are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love, receiving love, and you are worthy of your own self-respect. Thank you so much for listening. Email me, johnny@geektherapyradio.com. Take care. I love y'all. See you later. If you'd like to sponsor Geek Therapy Radio, just go to geektherapyradio.com and let's talk.